Well, I think I'm going to begin.
Yeah.
I know a few people are going to continue to enter the room, but I just want to welcome everyone here. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm very happy to be here in this space, engaged in a significant literary experience on this night in particular. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity. So thank you, Alysia, for joining us. For those of you in the audience, you see Alysia Sawchyn. She is our author, and Emma Johnson, who you also see on the screen, will be introducing her in a moment. Olivia Kane is another student of ours who's going to help us moderate the Q&A at the end. And you also see Ira Sugrungrung, who is an English professor in our Thomas Chair here at Kenyon College. I'm Elizabeth Dark, and I'm Associate Director of the Kenyon Review. Before we begin, I'd like to make a few announcements, and Olivia's going to help me by putting some links in the chat. We are the Kenyon Review, and we have a lovely reading series this year, and a lot of the events that we're having are part of a project we're doing called In My Time, a Narrative Space. And there will be a link for that in your chat in just a second, and I strongly encourage you to visit it. This is a space that we've created for people to come together while they are apart, and it includes small collections of works that have been pulled from the Kenyon Review and KR Online. It includes resources that have been put together by our KR associates, and it includes links to future readings that we're having, and I'll mention just a couple right now. In November, later this month, we have Jakira Diaz and Victoria Chang coming. That's going to be November 16th. And then we have Sakina Hoffler coming in December. So if you follow that link, it will take you to the information about the project as well as how to register for those other readings. In addition, we have Alicia's book for sale in our bookshop. So that link is now up in the chat, and we encourage you to purchase that. As well, if you are feeling uber generous, we always welcome donations to the Kenyon Review so that we can continue with programming and scholarships and all kinds of things that keep our literary organization thriving. So again, thank you for joining us. I'm now going to disappear, as is Olivia, and so is Ira, and Emma is going to introduce Alysia.
So I am so excited to be introducing Alysia Sawchyn this evening. She currently lives in Northern Virginia and is a features editor for the Rumpus. Her writing has appeared in Brevity, Prairie Schooner, Fourth Genre, as well as other publications. And A Fish Growing Lungs is her first book. It follows her misdiagnosis of bipolar 1 at age 18, and then the unraveling of that diagnosis and identity. But it also contains so much more within it, an intense and unsteady coming of age, full of self-harm, disordered eating, drug use and abuse, mental health and illness, and the great stigma and continued uncertainty surrounding that field. She plays with form and structure, cites art, music, and literature, creating a feeling of full, profound self-reflection. I devoured A Fish Growing Lungs when I first received it, immediately falling into its compelling voice and story. Each essay is powerful on its own, but they're linked in a way that moved me from one to the next, leaving me hungry for more. I'm from the Shenandoah Valley, so when Alysia described her trek up Old Rag and her stay at a lotus-shaped ashram, I could vividly picture every switchback and mountain peak. But there are so many things in these essays that were unknown and unfamiliar to me, feelings, thoughts, places I've never seen or been before, and she made those as real and concrete as the hills I grew up in. So it is with deep honor that I introduce Alysia Sawchyn.
Oh, thank you so much, Emma. That was such a lovely introduction. And thank you to the Kenyon Review for having me. It's such an honor to be here. Yeah, thank you. What a time, what a day. I hope everybody's doing all right. I have promised Ira that I wouldn't say anything. He doesn't want to know anything, but thank you all for being here with us right now. I've been a little glued to my cell phone today. Yeah, A Fish Growing Lungs is my first book. This is what it looks like. It's got a fish on it. And I'm going to read to you from the last essay in the book. It's called Flight. So the premise of this book broadly is that when I was 18 years old, I was diagnosed with bipolar 1. And when I was 25, I found out through a series of things that I had in fact been misdiagnosed and essentially been unnecessarily taking very strong antipsychotic medication for 7 years. So this is the last piece in the collection, and I think the only thing you really need to know about this is the quotes from Marx come from his intro to his critique of Hegel's Elements of the Philosophy of Right, and the shape of this was very loosely inspired by Didion's Slouching Toward Bethlehem. So this is called Flight. I first hear it from a Flemish man. The information isn't relevant to the subject being discussed, and maybe that's why it sticks in my memory. Marx misquoted. It's often said that religion is the opium for the people. The Flemish man is the stereotype of a professor, favoring tweed jackets and wearing unkempt gray and curly hair. But this is not the case. Marx's actual quote reads, "Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, just as it is the spirit of spiritless conditions. It is the opium of the people." I'm taking a course on intercultural communication in Brussels. Every Tuesday, I walk past perfect townhomes with windows that open sideways, past the sandwich shop, past the man who sells waffles embedded with beads of pearl sugar. The Flemish man teaches the class the correct way to ask for a private office, should we ever be employed in this city. I write my first piece of creative nonfiction. This is the season I fall back in with an ex-boyfriend. Opium is made from the latex of a particular poppy and, like all opioids, reduces pain. Taken in inappropriate quantities, the consequences often exceed the original discomfort that prompted its usage. Speaking from personal experience, opium looks a lot like rabbit shit. It is fall in Florida, and I am standing in the religion section of a Barnes & Noble. The air conditioning roars. The poppy at the center of my spine and the Ouroboros at the nape of my neck are inky and stark above a low-backed pink shirt. I haven't been in this part of a bookstore since I worked in one during high school, but not much has changed. The Qurans are kept on the highest shelf, and the texts on the whole are overwhelmingly Christian, Bibles and angels and post-rapture life. The book I am looking for takes its title from Habakkuk 3:19. Hinds feet on high places. I call Teresa at home and she answers, Long Island in the mouth. I'm gonna throw up standing here. I say, no, really, I think I'm gonna puke. We stay on the phone till the book is in my hand. I hang up to stand in line to pay because I'm not a total monster. No one is in a hurry here. Moleskin notebooks and miniature bars of Godiva chocolate wink on display. The man behind me in line talks shit about my tattoos loud enough for me to hear him and suspect, but too quietly for me to confront him with confidence. A few days later, Teresa eyes me over a cup of coffee so pale I suspect it is mostly creamer. Her bird bone fingers pick up a cigarette. Smoke washes the room foggy. The book I'd purchased lies on the table between us, paperback, white serif text on a purplish background. She says, I'll read the first 3 chapters between now and next week when I'm to see her next. This is me trying to fix my life. This is her trying to help. I want to believe in God. It seems important. 12-step programs claim to be non-denominational and non-religious, but there is a strong undercurrent of Christianity. I complain about the man in the bookstore, and Teresa shifts in her seat before redirecting the conversation. Do I remember the phone call, my overblown metaphorical nausea? Had I heard myself? Alysia, she says, you're prejudiced. And I have nothing to say except that I'll read the chapters before I see her next. I take a class with the heady title, Religious Motifs of Doubt and Faith in Western Literature. This is at a private university with cobblestone roads and silver minarets. The professor is somewhat of a mythic figure. His legend goes like this. He'd left the seminary to marry his wife, who had since died after many happy decades of marriage. Each year, he writes her a poem and reads it aloud at her grave on her birthday. The class watches doubt. Meryl Streep shudders beneath her black bonnet. I have just started to make friends, and her mannerisms in this film become something we'll return to. My friends are the ones who told me the story about our professor. We read Evelyn Waugh, Elie Wiesel, and E.L. Doctorow, and the only thing that seems certain after 16 weeks is that these people will humor me, faith, in spite of myself, doubt. I announce in class during a discussion, I don't think we're meant to understand everything. The professor nods. It feels like a blessing. I am always looking outside myself for a center. For my final project, I write a short story about a junkie kid who ODs and his friends tried to mourn him, only to discover they're standing around the wrong unmarked grave. This story is true. My teacher at the yoga studio is pale with long dark hair. She is a Pisces and a dancer and calls people babe in a casual way that makes the person being addressed feel beautiful. A Ganesh tapestry hangs at the front of the room. An altar sits in the back corner, adorned with a small vase of fresh flowers, a brass Shiva, another wooden Ganesh. She begins class playing the harmonium, but then we move and Curtis Mayfield trumpets move on up, and air purrs sexy boy. The air conditioner does not work well. My teacher says flight, and we raise our arms above our heads, palms pressing together. Flight as we straighten our bent knees, becoming stars. Flight as we spring forward from a crouch. Flight as we try to lift our bodies skyward. I topple. In a yoga studio, I only ever feel perfect or wretched. I sit back on my heels and watch those around me, birds and angels alike, and try to think only loving, lovely thoughts. My friend has more tattoos than anyone I've seen outside a tattoo shop. One day when I am waxing on too much about ink and impermanence in bodies, they say, blunt, tattoos just look fucking cool. They're right twice over. My first tattoo was that poppy in the middle of my back, which I got for no reason other than I wanted it. My most recent, my 13th, is another flower, a chrysanthemum blooming across my right triceps. It's all about the aesthetics. And my friend does look fucking cool. On their thigh is a red hammer and a sickle next to a black ink portrait of Marx. We are driving around Tampa listening to music. More accurately, they are driving and I'm sitting in the passenger seat and chain smoking. They let me do this even though they quit years ago. This is a thing we do in the summertime when the heat becomes too much. There's something about the velocity of a car that pairs well with loud music. After his bit about opium, Marx goes on to write, the overcoming of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for real happiness. The demand that they should abandon illusion about their condition is the demand to give up conditions that require illusions. To look and see myself, to be unafraid, and to work towards something more gentle and true, this is my test. I'll start small by admitting to the simple vanities I'd like to couch in mystery and meaning. Tattoos do look fucking cool. The music is louder than usual tonight. The moon slivers through the clouds and jasmine air snakes through the windows to press on our shoulders. Our friend has overdosed. We have just left her memorial. I barely cried. My test is ongoing. They turn up the volume even more and we sing. I turned atheist while living in the Bible Belt. It isn't the ideal environment for the change. Most people in town have what they consider a personal relationship with Jesus. My kitchen is yellow and I line the long windowsill above the sink with colored glass bottles. Everything about the room tries to hold in sunlight. My boyfriend is home rarely or all the time. He owns the house and I prepare the meals. Saturday mornings, I wake before sunrise to make him sandwiches. I agreed to all this before I moved in. Outside the house, I sit on the stoop and make phone calls and smoke cigarettes. I ring my best friend. Sometimes she talks to me and sometimes she talks to her children and sometimes I get it mixed up. I think I don't believe in God, I say. Do you think you got yourself clean? She asks. We do not talk about it again. I meet a woman who is more than twice my age and lives alone. She's been clean nearly 30 years, and when she says fuck in public, no one corrects her. She tells me that she does not believe in any god or gods, capitalized or otherwise. Standing in my yellow kitchen, frying eggs I will never eat on an electric stovetop, I think of her often. I stay at an ashram just south of Charlottesville, Virginia. We are surrounded by foothills. There is no meat or dairy or garlic or sugar in the cafeteria food, and I sign a piece of paper upon entry that says I will not consume any drugs or alcohol during my 4-day stay, including nicotine. I keep a pack of cigarettes and a lighter in my glove box and nicotine gum in my duffel bag. It is hot outside. Everyone wears white and mostly long pants and sleeves. Before an afternoon meditation session, 2 women whispered loudly. It sounds more like 2 possums chittering at dusk about another whose shoulders are bare. A man has lines from the St. Francis prayer tattooed on his inner forearm. Grant that I seek to comfort rather than to be comforted. I wake early for yoga classes, hike trail, sit in meditation 3 times a day, assist a monk writing letters to prisoners, and read Man's Search for Meaning. I am frantic. I check my body for ticks, stripping down in communal bathrooms, and worry I will become sick from the other practitioners. 2 weeks earlier, my friend chose a medically induced coma, hoping to get better, and never woke up. At the ashram, life's distractions are supposed to be stripped away. My brain ricochets. In yoga class, we repeat poses to watch the body's changes. This time, the hips feel like this. The last time, they felt like that. Learning to discern between injury and growth. Both are uncomfortable. The practice takes practice. Outside on the property, an Interfaith Temple sits in a dip of earth between hills. The building is shaped like a lotus and painted a gaudy blue and pink. I go to the 2nd floor and sit cross-legged for a long time, crying. I mumble the same incantation I'd repeated to a friend some months earlier. I can't, I can't, I can't. With the right audience, it could be a prayer. A monk tells me to be gentle with my mind. It is so young, she says. At night, after lights out, I drive off the property and smoke cigarettes. I hang my hand out the window like a teenager, trying to avoid the smoke sticking to my clothes. I chew Altoids afterward, and my mouth tastes rotten anyway. My first time in a Buddhist meditation hall, I'm the only person wearing jeans. The building is innocuous, tucked in among small businesses and cafes in sleepy Safety Harbor, Florida. And inside, it seems like everyone knows better than me. The walls are white and clean, and I have no cash to leave for a donation. Row after row of cushioned chairs with blinking metal frames face the altar. It is the focal point of the room. Food offerings and flowers surround a brass deity. This type of meditation practice is sparse. Breathing in, breathing out, listen, focus. Notice the mind's inability to focus. I stay still because I am overcompensating. I sit barefoot with my ankles crossed, and at the end, my feet feel like ants have taken up residence inside them. I open my eyes and see yellow and purple auras that linger despite fervent blinking. The halos are most noticeable against the white walls. I tell a resident about it. You stopped breathing, he says. I didn't, I insist. You weren't breathing all right. I am not expecting to be declared a mystic, but it turns out that even my breathing isn't good enough. I read Hallucinations by Oliver Sacks while overseeing a middle school detention room. I am partway through the chapter on hallucinogenic drugs and worry someone will ask about the book. We are in the middle of Indiana. Soybeans surround us. Police find a portable meth lab in the local Walmart bathroom. This is one kind of hell. In detention, students are only allowed to do schoolwork and to sit up straight, putting their heads down or feet up, listening to music, eating, talking, drinking. None of these are permitted. Instead of asking about the book, a student asks what the tattoo on my arm says. I do not answer. In later chapters, Sacks writes about seizures that precipitate religious conversions. People wake up believing in God. People wake up believing in nothing. Some parents at school some parents at this school call the front office and do not know what grade their child is enrolled in. A colleague points out a student whose father stabbed his mother to death while he and his younger brother were in the house. Despite overseeing the detention room, I never sentence a single student to it, though I probably should. My tattoo is the last line of a short story by another writer. And you ridiculous people, you expect me to help you. On the night Portugal wins the Euro Cup, I smoke cigarettes in Lisbon with a poet who has blue eyes and a half-shaved head. My body feels like it is shimmering, maybe see-through. Everyone is outdoors. Men walk down the street centers, arms on one another's shoulders, singing. Car horns blare at bystanders waving the country's flag. The city is in love with itself and everyone in it. The poet smiles and teases, twangs of the Virginia hills in her voice. I double dog dare you. A day before, she'd lifted her body up into crow pose while wearing a dress and standing on a castle rampart. I'd egged her on. Peacocks screeched in the gardens below us. After she'd succeeded, it was my turn, and I'd demurred. Back on the street, she's just a little bit drunk, and we are caught up in the night. Come on, she says. I've never done it before, I answer. The sidewalk is slick and cobblestoned. I would like to be loved. We are on a steep hill. I wait for a break in pedestrian traffic and hand the poet my cigarette. My hands plant on the smooth, dirty stones. I pitch my weight forward and my knees find a perch behind my shoulders. My center of gravity holds in my stomach, and for a few seconds, I escape myself. Thank you so much. That's the end of the book. Ta-da.
Thank you so much, Alysia. I will open it up for questions, but we just wanted to thank you. This was such a beautiful blessing to hear you read, especially tonight of all nights. And we're all incredibly grateful to be here together right now. Before I open it up for questions, I did have one of my own real quick, and it's the notion of emotional distance, which is a terribly daunting and difficult question for nonfiction writers in particular. Ira talks about it a lot in a lot of his classes, but it isn't necessarily this like cut and dry notion of knowing when you're ready to write about something. You'd written a piece for Brevity where you talked about collecting different medical records in order to like write yourself using what other people have written about you. And I was just wondering if there were either intentional structural approaches, emotional measures, or if there's anything specific that you did in order to give your own experience justice and to know when you had that emotional distance, because I feel like, especially for nonfiction, like it's not just knowing how to write about what is necessary, but also when. So I was wondering, because this book was such a process, if there were things that you found helpful, or if you just wanted to speak to the whole notion of emotional distance.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. I think especially like for students, who are like in writing programs. And so there's like a pressure to write about something. And the general rule that I have, my sort of overarching rule, is if I'm still really mad about something, or if I'm, like if it can't get workshopped, I probably shouldn't workshop it. Like if I'm still at the point where I'm unable to hear people speak critically, not about like my past behavior, but just even like how I rendered something on a page. Like if I still personally find that upsetting, like I need to put that in a drawer and just kind of wait for it. I think what was so interesting about Fish, particularly because it's a book project, like there were parts that were easy to write, and then there were parts which, as you mentioned, I kind of talk about in the Brevity essay, craft piece, that were not easy to write, that kind of snuck up on me. And by that point, though, I was kind of already invested in the project and knew that this is what I was writing. And so it became one of those things where it's like, well, I just have to do this now. And, I'd always been like formal forms, like different types of forms, different structures for essays was always something that my teachers had, talked about, and we talked about in class. And so it seemed normal, I guess is the right word for it. Like it seemed appropriate that like, oh, obviously like, I don't want to tell some like really maudlin story. The one that I think about in particular is Withdrawal, which was really hard to write. And it, you know, it's like a very long period of time. And initially it was like a tiny fragmented essay. And at some point I was like, you know what I really want this to be? I want it to be a timeline. And then I was the other thing that's sitting on my shoulder is like, well, why don't you make it a timeline then? Which was like, honestly, a really, just like technically speaking, kind of difficult. But so yeah, that's sort of my guiding philosophy. I wish I had like one heuristic, because I don't. I know that like, and I think too, it also depends on the subject matter. And this is just for me, but I've definitely like still been actively traumatized by stuff and written something that like I feel good about. And I've definitely written stuff and not felt good about it afterward. And so that's, I think, like a little bit of a gamble, you know, like it might come out and be brilliant or so.
And then I guess another question along with that is, I mean, anyone who's watching now, you employ a lot of humor in a lot of your discussion of various subjects. And I guess another question I have for you is, how do you know when to be funny about something and when not to? Or is it a matter of how, and I know it's not necessarily like a very straightforward question, but I mean, if it is such an integral part of your style and things like that, is this a way that you feel like, is it like a better reflection of your voice as a writer? Is it an intentional choice? Because even while you're speaking, I mean, you're making things funny and engaging and things like that. But yeah, if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, of course. So also, I meant to actually add also with your last question, which I forgot, so I'm going to say it now, is in my master's program, before I got my MFA, my thesis project was about doing service learning with mental health facilities. So I'd already spent a number of years doing scholarly work on like disability narratives, on illness narratives. And so I had spent a fair amount of time researching how other people had written stories about illness and how it helped or did not help them. So even though it wasn't like a conscious thing that I sort of knew I would be then going on to like then write my own experience, that wasn't an intentional thing, but I did have that at my disposal, which I do think helped, even though I didn't like very consciously think about it a lot. But in terms of, I mean, I'm honestly like kind of a walking cartoon character. You can ask Ira, like I have a terrible sense of humor. I tell jokes all the time and I'm really sarcastic. I often find that like it is easier for me to be sincere in writing than it is in speech. And so some of the humor that's in the book is, you know, just, this is kind of like going away from a craft thing, but I mean, it speaks to my voice, I suppose, my writing voice. And it's sort of like my belief that like the world, depending on how you look at it, or like the stuff that happened in Fish, depending on how you look at it, can be like really, really tragic and horrible. Or, you know, it can be tragic and horrible, but kind of entertaining. And so I just kind of like choose to see the world, for the most part, like on the entertaining side of things. And I'm also, Heather Sellers has this, she calls it going cold, but it's the idea that like you have two columns. I'm going to butcher this, so I hope she forgives me, but you essentially have two columns. So one is like the subject matter, 1 through 10, and the other is the writing itself, 1 through 10. And the idea is that your numbers on these scales added together should never add up to more than 11. So for example, if you're writing about like really heavy subject matter, like your prose should not also be really heavy, really intense. We were actually talking about Annie Dillard earlier today, and her essay, the Weasel essay, which I'm so bad with titles, but which, as Ira pointed out. But anyway, you know, the premise of Living Like Weasels, that's what it is, Living Like Weasels, is that she like watches a weasel. Like that's essentially the plot, right? But she's Annie Dillard, so she's like, the weasel, and it becomes this like really intense thing that everybody's like deeply emotionally invested in. So that's an example of like the subject and then the writing, right? And so that that is something that I actually do pay attention to, is like trying to balance out those two sort of metrics in my writing.
So we do have a question from an audience member. It is, in the process of writing this collection, did you discover your form as you were writing the essays, or were you eager to experiment with specific forms and your essays were born from that intentionality? So another structural question.
Yeah. So my brain just wanted, when I was writing the bulk of this book, my brain just wanted to only write braided essays, just to be really honest with you. And to the point where, like, actually the poet in Portugal, I was talking to her at one point and I was like, what if I just wrote a whole book of braided essays? And she's like, no, don't do that. So I knew that a couple of them, I definitely wanted them to be braided. Dog Brain, which is not called Dog Brain in the book, but Deep Sea Creatures. It was originally published in fourth genre as Dog Brain, but that's a braided essay. And I knew I wanted that to stay that way. So I had a couple like ones in place already. And then later in the revision process, it became more of a conscious choice in terms of like, okay, you know, we have a narrative essay here, we have something like kind of funky and formal, like let's try to pace these out in such a way that the reading experience is enjoyable for the reader. So some of them came later, specifically Withdrawal, and I think the Absidarian also came later. Ira's nodding, I'm so glad one of us remembers. And the Absidarian also came later. And both of those were like, I already had the content and a fair amount of the work done, but then once I found the form, it all sort of like clicked into place for me.
I believe Ira may have had some questions.
Yeah, I always have questions. This is like us sitting in the office again, and me saying like, but why are you doing this? So like one of the things I love about the book, which everyone should get, is the notes section in the back, right? And one of the things that I found really interesting are, of course, like the various types of research you're doing, right? Like there's research that, I mean, one of it is like looking at reading Foucault. There's pop culture research, right? Like, you know, in one of my favorite chapters, the Castle chapter, and we're talking about Slayer and music. So my question is like, how does research work into the personal for you? Like, in what ways can it open up things that you weren't aware of before?
Yeah, so I bought this etymology dictionary and it's just sitting on my bookshelf and it's like probably my most prized possession right now. I love etymology, and I think that's sort of like how I sort of entered into the world of, or the idea of like using research to like make meaning and contextualize and draw connections. And part of it is, I think we all experience life, you know, through all these like different filters, whatever they may be. And I just wanted to keep track of them a little bit better, you know, than just thinking like, oh, I just thought of it, you know, and instead like sort of show the bones a little bit of like what was happening. Jill Chrisman, who I believe is in the audience, also sort of introduced me to the notion of an expansive notion of research in creative writing, which is to say, so I'm just going to use her piece as an example because I love it so much, but she has a piece called The Avocado, and she's talked about like, you know, how many avocados did she eat in the process of writing this essay to like look at it and touch it and feel it. And that absolutely has influenced my writing process as well. So in addition to the secondary research, there's also, you know, revisiting old places, digging through the medical records, and just also, I think for me, having done a fair amount of drugs and been diagnosed with serious mental illness, I just want like something that sort of grounds me a little bit, or at least supports my recollection of things. And if it doesn't, I think that also then becomes interesting given the context of the book and the subject matter in it.
I have two that have come through via email. And they're both craft or like final decision questions, if you will. One person says, I'm drawn to the titles that you choose as they tend to be phrases. How did you decide to do that?
So some of the titles got changed once we changed from the book title. So I retweeted about this, so I feel like I'm morally obligated to put myself on blast for this. I am really, really bad at titles. And the Jill Christman story, this is my second Jill Christman story for the night. So I got my MA at Ball State, and I took some creative writing classes while I was there, one of which was with Jill Christman. And I forget what essay I was writing, but I was writing an essay, and we were like conferencing about it. And she very gently said, like, Alysia, you know, writing titles is really hard. Like sometimes we have to try 40 different times, and sometimes it's the 40th title that's the right title. And I like pretty much like cried, not cried, you know, but like me cried. So like, I was like, Jill, that is my 40th title. And just without like missing a beat, she very calmly was like, and sometimes we need another 40. And I tell that story when I teach all the time, just because it is like, that is 100% like true for me when it comes to titles. So one of the really bad titles that I had for this book, I can't believe I'm saying this, but one of the really bad titles I had for this book was White Snake, which is the name of a rock band, but also the Chinese zodiac sign I was born under. And God bless Ira, he like actually kept a straight face where I was like, what do you think about this? And he was like, why don't we keep trying, you know, just, anyway, when I was accepted by my publisher, the title of the manuscript was From the Cliff Face, which I did not love. I really wanted it to be Cliff Notes, but I recognized like that's a whole other thing and that would open it up too much. So honestly, like we went through a couple of rounds of edits for the whole book. And then at that point he was like, all right, we have to actually choose a title for your book now. So I literally read through my book, and I wrote on a piece of paper like 200 or so title possibilities and shoved it in a drawer for a little bit, and then pulled it out and then circled, I forget how many, like 10 or so, and sent them to my publisher. And this was both of our favorites. So once we had The Fish, Growing Lungs, a couple of the essays or chapters got retitled to be more fishy, to make it just like a little bit more cohesive. So Deep Sea Creatures was like the big one, which used to be called Dog Brain, and then Gutted was initially called Rice Grain Girl. So I think those are the only two ones we retitled, but we did a little bit of that just so it could come together a bit more.
That's very helpful insight into the process. You know, that the titles don't come first, they come later, and then maybe even later. The second question is also about choices you made within the essays about details. This person really likes your details, and you know, when you're writing an essay, that's everything, the details that you choose. So what draws you to the details that you choose for your essays?
That's such a great question, because like I think it's the details that any writer notices that make their writing, if that sort of makes any sense. Like you can write the same story 100 different ways, and each writer is going to write the story differently. It's like, you know, this is a more of an example, like a crime scene, right? Like what happened? What did you see? And so I think it sort of goes back to like the sarcasm and my voice, is it's just like, you know, these are the things that I just happen to pay attention to. I'm like, and I don't mean this in like a bad way, but I'm just like, I'm relatively self-centered. I'm like pretty awkward, and like I spend a lot of time lying in bed, like thinking about like, oh God, I can't believe I did that. You know, and some of it is, I was actually talking about this earlier today. So my first drafts are they're like, I try to get all the main things that happen out. Some people write big first drafts. That's not me. I just sort of try to hit all the main points. And then like my 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you know, drafts, those are where a lot of times I'll build in the details. So like from the piece I read for tonight, for example, at I like went and got a bunch of the books and like looked at them, and I was like, all right, do I want to talk about what this cover looks like? Do I want to talk about, you know, hey friend, do you really have a Marx tattoo on your thigh? Because I'm pretty sure you do. And they're like, yeah, and this is next to it. So in my later drafts is a lot of times where I'll like flesh out, you know, the details, and I start picking. And so much of it is patterning too, I think, right? It's like the way we sort of construct meaning, and the human mind likes to build patterns, and I, you know, am definitely guilty of that, and sometimes slightly magical thinking. But I think that, I don't know, I don't think I have a good answer for this. I'm sorry, but I like to pay attention to things, and I think that every writer and the different things they pay attention to is what makes their writing unique and interesting and particular to them.
Thank you.
I believe Emma might have had a question as well.
Yeah, I was curious sort of about like the genesis of this book. You talked about when you were getting your master's and doing research, you weren't thinking about that this is going to be for this project. But I'm sort of curious, when was the moment when you felt like you had enough emotional distance, or you realized like, okay, this is something I want to dive into in like this form?
I don't know if I had enough emotional distance when I started. I mean, maybe I did, but I very clearly remember, so in my MFA program, sorry, let me rephrase that. Going into my MFA program, I had no plan to write about this. I had other plans. And I started my MFA program, and I became friends with two fiction writers who were like, oh, I have a draft of my novel. They don't sound like that at all, so I shouldn't do that. But they both had drafts of their novels already, like in full. And I was like, oh no, what have I done? I'm so behind. So I very, you know, by the end of my first semester, I was trying to figure out what I would want my project to be. And I don't know, I've had a relatively interesting life. But I just sort of like had one of those moments where I'm like, you know, this is probably the strangest thing that's happened to me. And I also had not really seen it in literature. I'd heard about it anecdotally from a number of people, particularly women who were also in recovery. But in terms of finding a book about misdiagnosed mental illness, I really had not seen that, which I thought was, I hate to say important, but I thought it was important, you know. And I went into Ira's office, as I want to do, and just sort of sat down, and I was like, hey, Ira, I was misdiagnosed with mental illness when I was 18 and put in a psych ward. I'm fine, by the way. And 7 years later, I found that they were wrong. Is that, can I write about, is that a book? And he was like, well, I think you have to write it to find out if it's a book or not. And I really did not like that answer. But I sat down and I made like a bubble map, basically, and sort of plotted out the various, what essentially became the essays, but they were like the various components that like made up the story of the diagnosis. I feel like I talk about this a lot, but Jennifer Egan, I heard her give a talk about Goon Squad, and she talks about how she envisioned it like a mixtape. And I really liked that. And for me, the metaphor I used when organizing Fish was a kaleidoscope. So it was like, okay, you have a misdiagnosis and then you shift, right? So you're still looking at the same things, but you're looking at them from a different perspective. So it was like, okay, misdiagnosis in the context of self-harm, misdiagnosis in the context of drug use. And I had my bubble map, and I just like went along, and I was like, all right, time to write this one. And just kind of like, was pretty methodical about it at that point.
Thank you.
I believe Ira might have had a question as well.
Yes. So like one of my favorite chapters in the book, Alysia, is the newly titled Deep Sea Creatures. Though when I saw it, it was dog brain, and I think I laughed a little bit when
I think that was another one of those titles we were like, Alysia.
Yeah.
Like they're gonna think it's about dogs and they're gonna be mad.
Oh man. But I think we spent a lot of time actually talking about titles, like maybe too much, but it all worked out in the end. But I think the line that I keep coming back to in this chapter is my medical history is becoming a revisionist one, right? Like, And given like the topic of mental health and the things that you talk about in the book, like the DSM and the changes that are happening all the time with mental health, what's listed, what gets taken out, right? In many ways, like, when you look at the writing of this book, right, is part of the thing that you're trying to like use your life as an example of, is like this kind of slippery slope of how mental health is talked about in terms of diagnosis, right? When things are always changing, especially when things come to like deal with the brain.
Yeah, I would say, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I already, in my writing, I tend pretty naturally to like exposition and being meta, because that's just kind of the way I already lean. But yeah, I went into this knowing that I did not want this to be like a success story, because I don't know, I think even now, like my understanding of mental health and like is just, it's so nebulous. And I interviewed a number of medical professionals for this as well. And there's just so much. There's so much that we don't know. And I think like ultimately where I've sort of like come down in terms of my own understanding of psychiatrists in general is like, it's great when they're helpful, and many of them are helpful, and that's wonderful, and like I'll make use of that. But I definitely grew up, and I talk about this in the book, like my conceptions of mental illness growing up were like heavily influenced by how it was portrayed in literature, which is like not necessarily accurate or helpful. And I mean, like, it's honestly, it's complicated, and I think it's hard to tell a complicated story when like the nitty gritty is like your paperwork, right? Like I think Esme Wang does like a really amazing job in like the collected schizophrenias, right? But that had not come out like when I started writing my book. And so it was really, I think like the empathy exams came out in like 2016 maybe, and that had some of it. And there's Anne Fadiman, whatever, you know what I'm trying to say, the spirit catches you and you fall down. But it was so important to me to like have that hand tip of like, here again, like just showing the bones, like this is how it works. Like, don't just sit there and be like, oh, okay. Cause that's, you know, when I was diagnosed, I was like 18 years old, like fresh out of a mental institution, kind of homeless. And like, you tell me I'm bipolar. Okay, cool. Like, I don't want to get locked up again. I'm bipolar. What do I have to do to not literally be like institutionalized again? And I'm not going to think about that real hard because, you know, my sort of primary thing is like, I really don't want to end up there again. So I just do think it's important to like, you know, have that conversation about changes and, you know, trying things. And I wish that like everybody, you know, had the time and space and resources to do that is the other thing too. Like, I'm really fortunate that I had insurance and I was able to like do that, or like even get diagnosed in the first place, right? Instead of just like bumbling through life, like deeply unhappy and causing much chaos and not having, you know, so it's all a mess. That doesn't mean we shouldn't like talk about it or write about it, but I didn't want to like flatten it into not a mess.
Elena Pasarello, I think, had written about your book and saying that you do a beautiful job of exploring that gray area as opposed to making it a dichotomy of like one or the other. And I mean, I guess to kind of wrap up, is there anything you'd like to talk about with regard to either structural, thematic, or just overall like writerly approaches to the gray areas that you cover and things like that? Because like you said, I mean, there is too few like pieces and explorations in this similar vein, and I think in a lot of ways like that does carry a lot of weight for your work because you're approaching something in a gray area that hasn't been done in a similar way before. So I guess if there's anything you have to say about that as a final note.
I guess maybe two things. One is, it's funny because I really don't want to be like a gray area person. Like, I really want definite, sure answers immediately. She said on November 4th. But like, you know, in the context of like doctors, for instance, right? Like, I really want to go to a doctor and have him prick my fingertip and be like, you are definitively X. Here is the medication. And it's right. Like, it's just, but that's not the world. And so I think like just for me in general, like one of my personal sort of things is like navigating my desire for certainty while making space for ambiguity. So that's just kind of like an ongoing puzzle of mine. But also I think that I don't know, I think like art takes a long time to make. And I think it's important, and I think I'm just talking to myself when I say this, but I think it's really important to be like patient with the process of that making, which is hard in the world when like you need to feed yourself and capitalism's jaws are chomping at you. But art takes a long time to make, and I think for me, I'm happy with like the way my little fish came out. You know, the first essay started, which, and this is by no means like the long side of how long it takes people to write a book, but I first started drafting an essay in this collection in 2014, and it came out in 2020. And like 3 of those years were like solid, nonstop. I'm literally, my job is to write this book, which is an enormous privilege, right? And so just being patient with what that looks like and being like flexible to the changes as they come, instead of, you know, remaining so rigid and like, no, this is what I wanted to do and it's what it's going to be, and sort of like buckling down, and just sort of making room for a little bit of grace for myself and the other people around me in the writing process.
Alysia, thank you so much. This has been a lovely way to spend this day. And I thank you for spending it with us. Thanks also to Ira for helping make this happen. Thank you, Olivia, for the Q&A. Thank you, Emma, for the introduction. It's so great to see your faces, as none of us are together in person right now. Before we wrap up, I would like to remind you that you can purchase Alicia's book at our bookshop. And that link is going to pop up, and it's a beautiful book with a beautiful title. That link will pop up in our chat. Also, feel free to take a look at our project, In My Time, a narrative space. This is our hope that we are creating a space where you can grapple with all that is going on right now, and we can grapple together through literary pursuits. And also, please consider donating to the Kenyon Review if that is something that you are able to do and interested in doing. And Alysia, I appreciate you sort of wrapping up with these ideas of existing within a gray area and being very aware of our mental health. And so to all of you out there, I hope that you are being very gracious with yourself and tending to what we need in this moment. So again, thank you, Alysia, and everyone have a wonderful night.
Thank you so much for having me.